lot of people have been around Bibles. You've seen a Bible. Maybe you've been in a store, of Barnes & Nobles or something, to buy a Bible. Maybe you pulled one out of a Bible in your hotel room and looked at it and you're thinking, what is this book? What is this thing? Some of you are interacting with a Bible every day or every week, and you're going to church and you're opening it to various things. And you know what's interesting? A lot of people own a Bible, but very few people have read a Bible. I don't know if you have. I mean, I read mine pretty consistently, and I've studied it for years now, and I want to help demystify this book a bit, because there are a lot of weird thoughts that people have about a Bible just because we put it between a couple pieces of leather with really thin pages and all that stuff. And you open it and you see things like, what is an Epha? That just sounds really bad. I'm not even gonna read that book, whatever that thing was. What's a Habakkuk, and a who's Malachi? You know, there's all kinds of weird things that you can find in the Bible just in the chapter titles, right? So what is this book? First of all, maybe you're thinking, I gotta read this thing from the beginning to the end. Well, that's not normal. That's not how you approach a Bible. Maybe you think there's only one author. Well, that's not true either. In fact, some of us begin to think this is just one book, but it's not. What I want you to do is consider it more like this, a Kindle. It's a collection of books. It was the kind of compilation series of all kinds of literature. And as I take us on a journey on this book, I hope that it helps you begin to grasp it and understand it better and actually want to begin to interact with it. First of all, you need to understand a little bit about this thing. This is a collection of 66 books. It is not one book. It is a collection of ancient manuscripts, honestly, that used to be in scrolls. You'd have 3 major scrolls and a whole bunch of other writings and scrolls that would be passed around, and people would open these things and read them. Eventually, they would be collected in several volumes or in one giant volume, and it would be called the Bible. But this is 66 books written by dozens of authors over 1,500 years. This is an ancient book that dates from way back in the 1500 BC all the way up to the 1st century, 100 AD. And what we're looking at is all kinds of information. Now, there are 2 parts of the Bible. You may have heard of them as the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's a weird statement. What's a testament? A testament is like a testimony, right? It's something that's stating the truth. They're a way of sitting down and being a witness about something. And so there's the Old Witness and the New Witness. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament. Or some people would say it's the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. But really the best way to understand this is not the Old Testament and the New Testament. Those are kind of our versions of how we talk about the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Scriptures. And so the vast majority of this book, of this compilation, of this collection, are actually the Hebrew Scriptures. And when I look at it just in this study Bible here, what you actually have is this is the Christian Scriptures, and that is the Hebrew Scriptures. And when you begin to realize that this is the Hebrew Scriptures, we begin to go, oh, it's 2 collections. Because even the Hebrew Scriptures was a collection that they would call the Tanakh. That's a big word, but it really stands for 3 parts. It means the Torah, or the law, the prophets, and the writings. The Torah was 5 books that we all know today as the law of Moses, and then the next scroll, or the next section, was really the prophets, which included 4 former prophets of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. If you're a Christian, you're sitting there thinking, those aren't prophets, but that's how the Hebrew Scriptures put it. And then there's the 4 latter prophets of Isaiah all the way up through the Book of the 12, which was considered one book. And the Book of the 12 are the 12 minor prophets, as we call them today. And that's all the way from just Hosea and all the way to a guy like Malachi, not Malachi. But yeah, it sounds like Malachi when you look at it. But as we examine this, what you're seeing is that this is the middle portion. It's all the prophets. And then there's this last section called the writings. Now the writings, you have the law, the prophets, and the writings. The writings held like the poetry and the Psalms, and it had the Proverbs in it. In fact, it held the book of Daniel. It held Esther and Nehemiah as one book. And these are all this kind of finalized history, kind of the end. They were typically a lot of the information that happens after Israel had been taken away by this country called Babylon and brought back into their own country. And as they're reflecting on their writings, these are the things that they've accommodated. Now, That's the Hebrew scriptures, and the other side, the New Testament, is the Christian scriptures. And what we have here are 27 writings that Christians have considered scriptures, starting with the 4 Gospels, working through all of the letters of Paul that's after the history called Acts. And Dr. Luke, who also wrote what we call the Gospel of Luke, wrote a history of the early church of its first 40 years. And we have that in here, and that would have been its own scroll. It's a fairly large book. But then you start to move forward and you get the letters of Paul. And these letters of Paul are actually put in the Bible, if you've bought one, from the longest letter to the shortest letter in the Greek. And so what we look at here is these books are all put in the longest to the shortest. The next section is called the Catholic letters. They involve different authors who are apostles or church leaders. So you've got like Peter, the apostle, you got John, the apostle, you got James and Jude, the brothers of Jesus. And then there's the last book, which is like this kind of really interesting, highly stylized revelatory information about the end of the world we call the book of Revelation. And so these are the collections that you find in a Bible, the Christian scriptures and the Hebrew scriptures. So you've got a Bible and you're looking at this and you're going, okay, I got a Hebrew scriptures, I've got a Christian scriptures, all collected together in one big book. Got it, perfect. But aren't there books that aren't in there? Maybe you're even looking at your table of contents and you're going, hey, I've got these books called Maccabees and Ecclesiasticus and Tobit. What's up with that? Why aren't those being included in what you're talking about? And the answer is because there are books that we call Apocrypha that aren't considered part of the canon. The canon? Yeah, that thing that goes boom! No, not that thing. I'm talking about a canon, which is like a measuring rod, a line. And a canon is actually kind of a standard. And so there was a standard that was set by the Hebrews for their scriptures and by the Christians for their scriptures. And so as we understand this, we begin to see that not all the books that exist by Hebrew people that talk about God wind up in the scriptures. And the same thing when it comes to Christians. In fact, we call those Apocrypha, and they're taken in the scriptures by Catholic Christians and by Eastern Orthodox Christians, but not by Protestant Christians. And there's some good reasons why Protestants don't actually hold on to these. First of all, Jesus nor the apostles quote ever from any of these Old Testament apocryphal books, these Hebrew other writings. In fact, Jesus seems to indicate that the prophets, who is what they were trying to collect, the messages from the prophets, kind of ended at Zechariah. In fact, Jesus said this while he's talking to some of the Pharisees. He says, "Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you'll kill and crucify, some you'll flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah." I mean, Abel was the first guy to die, to Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. That's the last prophet that Jesus mentions. And so all the message of the scriptures, they would say, was between these two guys. Ecclesiasticus and Tobit and Syria, all these others are post Zechariah. They're after what Jesus says. Third, the ancient Hebrews didn't even include these in their Hebrew scriptures. Now, they're found in a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures called the Septuagint, but they are not found in the collection of Hebrew scriptures that are out there. And later, when Jerome, who was a church father, actually translates the Bible from the Greek and the Hebrew into Latin, the kind of the English of the time period in the Roman Empire, he said the Hebrew people aren't even using this, so why would we include it? Now, fourth, there were commentaries that were written about this Hebrew canon that we're looking at, the Hebrew scriptures we have, but the extra books, they don't even have commentaries written about them. They weren't revered in the same way. They weren't held in high esteem. And I think these are good enough reasons just to say, hey, I think what we've got here are the actual scriptures that the Hebrew people thought were given to them by God and that they should be reading as part of their religious text. And so we keep the collection that the Hebrews had and the collection of the Christians. But, some of you guys are going, hey, there are some other books I've heard of that should be in the New Testament. Wasn't there this deep, dark, evil council that met together and decided we're going to make Jesus God? That book's not in, that book's not in. No, nothing like that ever happened. That's just fiction. Cool, fun, interesting, but it's totally stupid. No. The books that we have as the Christian books are the earliest attested books that are attached to an apostle and teach the teachings of Jesus. And this is the basic point. All the other books that were almost included, like one called the Didache, the Teaching of the 12, or the letters from Clement, or the letter of Barnabas, the Epistle of Barnabas, these were almost included because churches were using them. But once it was looked at and examined by a bunch of other churches after the persecution lifted and churches could actually get together in the 400s, they went, you're right, we've never heard of this. We never used that. Well, we got that, but we never brought that in. In fact, the 27 books we have today were pretty much the books from the late 100s, early 200s that everybody had kind of agreed should be the ones that are being used. And so you'll hear about Thomas's infancy gospel and Jesus turning little clay birds into real birds and flying them off and then cursing some boy who made fun of him. Or you'll find that there's these tales of Gospel of Peter with a giant cross coming out of the tomb behind Jesus, or even the Gospel of Thomas, which says statements like, if a woman wants to enter into the kingdom of heaven, they got to become a man. That doesn't sound like Jesus, but it sounds like fan fiction. What's a fan fiction? Hey, when you liked Harry Potter or Star Wars enough, maybe you want to write a story about it. If you liked Jesus enough, hey, maybe you want to write a story about him. And that's exactly what happened. There's this group called the Gnostics that were seeking esoteric knowledge to go through the realms of the heavens to get higher and higher to the original God. And they viewed Jesus as one of those helpful people, and so they loved to write fan fiction about Jesus. And that's what the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is, or the Gospel of Judas, or these other Gospel of Peter and the Cross Gospels. They were early Christians and Gnostics wrestling and writing about Jesus and being excited about him. Now, today, we can read, most of the church fathers said, we know that was invented. We know that's not ours. And so they didn't include them in the lists. And so we'll get into a little bit more about that as we go further, but you can find out that today what you've got are these 66 books. They're organized so you can find them, you can locate them. In fact, what's interesting is the chapters and the verses weren't original in the documents. We added those so that you can reference the text. And so as you read a Bible, don't just read a verse, read the chapter, read the paragraph. Understand this was intended as a whole unit and that all these different authors had intention to teach us something. And so also understand these are translations in your English. It comes from a Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. And so there's 3 other languages that these Hebrew scriptures and Christian scriptures were written in. And so the question may be like, okay, cool, I get my Bible, but how do you get the Bible you have? Or how do you get the Bible that's on your phone? How did we get this? And so that's where we want to go to next. How did you wind up with this Bible today in English? And so I want to walk you through a little bit of that in the next video.